So far in this course, we discussed about basic cloud concepts that you should be aware of before deep dive for the cloud certification. We will talk about AWS cloud certifications and cover the topics for AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. So let's get started. AWS has its customers across the globe and every customer wants the better performance of their applications. So AWS hosted its infrastructure globally and designed the infrastructure to provide the low latency and high speed access to AWS services for its customers. AWS has wide range of services to offer to its customers, and its cloud concepts are broadly categorized into four different categories. AWS Global Infrastructure that include physical infrastructures like regions, availability zones, local zones as locations. The other broad category is security and compliance that include the security control and compliance certifications. Next, we have architecture on AWS that include best practices for deployment and operations on the AWS cloud. And then AWS services that include compute, storage, database, networking, and other services offered by AWS. So we will talk about each components in detail in this course. So first, let's talk about the AWS global infrastructure. AWS has customers across the globe and every customer wants the better performance of the application. AWS hosted its infrastructure globally to provide the low latency and high speed access of AWS services to its customers. AWS global infrastructure include the multiple components like regions. A region is a geographical area where AWS hosted its physical infrastructure. There are multiple regions, and each region consists of multiple availability zones. Availability zones. Within region, we have availability zones, and each availability zone contains multiple data centers for high availability. Local zones bring cloud more closer to users and provide the low latency access of AWS services to customers. As locations used to deliver content with better performance to end users and used as a content delivery network. Direct connect locations are physical locations where customer can establish a dedicated connection to AWS to access the cloud resources. So don't worry if you are not aware about any of these components. We will talk about these components in detail and we'll see how you can utilize these core components of AWS global infrastructure to host your applications on the cloud. First, let's talk about the AWS region. Every customer wants to host the application closer to their location for better performance. So AWS has hosted its physical data centers at multiple geographical locations in the world. Regions are those geographical areas where AWS decide to host their physical data centers. So customers can choose a data center close to them to host their applications. AWS has multiple regions and each AWS region can have one or more availability zones. You can host your application in closest AWS region for better performance. The closer is the region, the better is the performance for the users. At the time of this recording, AWS currently has 30 regions globally. AWS keep on adding the new regions on time to time basis. You can always get the updated list of AWS regions and availability zones from the Amazon official website. To get the updated list of AWS regions and availability zone, let's go to the Amazon official website, aws.amazon.com. And if you scroll down the page, at the bottom of the page, you will see the section Global Network of AWS region. And this is the list of the AWS regions where AWS has hosted its region across the globe. There are two color dots, the green one and the red one. The green dot means the AWS region is official and you can host your applications in this region. And the red zone means the AWS region is coming soon and it's not yet ready to host the applications for the users. And if you want to see how many availability zones are hosted in each region, just click on the list view. And here you will see the number of availability zone in each AWS region. So if you are planning to host your applications on AWS cloud, you can always come to aws.amazon.com to confirm the closest AWS region. Next, let's talk about availability zones. Availability zones are physical locations where multiple data centers are hosted. Availability zone exists within AWS region. There are multiple availability zones within a region which are connected to each other with high speed and low latency network. So first, we have AWS regions. Within each AWS region, there are one or more availability zone, and each availability zone has one or more data centers connected to each other with high speed links. The availability zones are designed to provide high level availability for your applications and data. In simple terms, availability zone is a collection of data centers within a region with redundant power, network, and connectivity to enable the high availability of your applications. Meaning, if one data center within a region goes down, the users will still be able to access their application via other data center in the availability zone. It is important to note that each availability zone is associated with a specific AWS region. Availability zone has a clusters of data center within a region with redundant power, networking, and connectivity to enable the high availability of your application. There are currently 96 availability zones globally in 30 regions. Now let's just take a high level look at some regions within India. So if you want to validate the availability zones within region, just hover over the name of the region. You see that in Mumbai region, we have three availability zone and two local zone. In Hyderabad region, we have three availability zones. You can also click on list view and see the region name for which you want to find how many availability zones are there. So we are talking about India. So in India, we have two regions. One is Mumbai region that's launched in 2016. Here we have three availability zones and two local zones. And in Hyderabad region, we have only three availability zones. So we talked about AWS regions and availability zone. So when we plan to host a application on AWS, be it for mobile users, home users, or corporates, we get an option to select the region and availability zone to host the application. Once you host the application, then user can access the application via internet or direct connect based on your application architecture. When one of the data center in availability zone goes down, your application will be accessed via redundant data center. And if in worst case, complete availability zone goes down, you can access your application via redundant availability zone. So when you create a resource in AWS, you get an option to select the region and availability zone within that region to host your resources. For example, you might see something like US West 1A. So let's break it down and understand what it means. So first, you might guess that US in the beginning stands for the United States, and you would be correct. Yeah, this is going to be the area. We then have a sub area within that main area. So in this case, this would be the western side of the US. We then have a number because we might have two different regions or more in a specific area. And this is the case. We have both US West 1, which is Northern California, and US West 2, which is Oregon. But we leave off the letter that gives us the region name. So when we are talking about a region, we would say US West 1 as a region. But if you want the entire availability zone name, it would include everything from US West all the way to 1A. So we talked about AWS availability zone. Let's quickly summarize the key points of availability zone. Resiliency. Each AWS availability zone is a physically separate and independent data center with its own power, cooling, and networking infrastructure. Redundancy. AWS deploys multiple availability zones in a region to ensure high availability and fault tolerance of your application. In general, there are at least two and up to six availability zones per region. High availability. AWS availability zone within a region are interconnected with high-speed, low-latency networks to enable the data replication and communication between them. AWS availability zone are designed to provide high availability, and AWS guarantees at least 99.99% availability of application. Deployment. AWS recommends to design your application to be highly available across multiple availability zones to ensure maximum uptime and fault tolerance. You can launch the resources such as EC2 instance, RDS database, and Elastic Load Balancer in one or more availability zone to achieve the high availability and fault tolerance of your application. The cost of deploying the resources across multiple availability zone may be higher than deploying the resource in single availability zone. AWS also provides cross-region replication to help you replicate data between regions. AWS availability zone may have resource limitations such as the number of instances that you can launch or the type of instances that are available in a specific region. So when you are designing your application for AWS, you should consider all these points before hosting your infrastructure on the AWS cloud. Next, let's talk about AWS local zone. You would like to host your infrastructure closer to the end users. And AWS can't build the data centers everywhere, so AWS come up with a solution of local zone. Local zones are like mini data center that places compute, storage, database, and other AWS services closer to end user. You can place resources such as compute and storage at multiple locations closer to the end users. AWS local zones place compute, storage, database, and other AWS services closer to end users. Each local zone is an extension of a AWS region. Local zones provide a high bandwidth and secure connection between local workload and those running in the AWS region. Local zones are essentially a way for AWS to bring the cloud closer to the customers, providing customers with more localized, high performance service with the same level of security and compliance as the main AWS infrastructure. To use the local zone, we need to enable it first, and then we can host our resources in the local zone. Next, let's talk about AWS point of presence. AWS point of presence refers to the physical location where AWS has placed its infrastructure outside of AWS region. The point of presence connected to the AWS regions with high-speed network to provide access to AWS services. Point of presence are spread around the world, which enable the customer to access the services with the lowest possible latency. You can think of AWS point of presence as gateway to the cloud. They allow the customers to access the services such as Amazon EC2, S3, and RDS from any location with the low latency, high throughput, and high availability. Within the overall points of presence, there are two types of infrastructure: as locations and regional cache. Next, let's talk about as locations. AWS as locations are places around the world where AWS has hosted its servers. These servers used to cache and serve the content such as website pages, images, and videos to users as quickly as possible. As locations keep a copy of the content closer to the user so that it can be delivered quickly. So when you use an app or website that is hosted on AWS, the information you need is delivered to you from one of these as locations. These as locations are distributed around the world and are used by services such as Amazon CloudFront or Route 53 to deliver the content with low latency and high performance. And if you are not aware about CloudFront and Route 53, don't worry, we will talk about these in next module. By placing servers in as locations, AWS is able to provide a faster and more reliable experience to users around the world. As locations are especially beneficial for the users located far away from the main location, which can help to improve the performance of websites, streaming services, and other content delivery. For example, if you wanted to create a single page application and you want to be sure that your application could be served as quickly as possible to all the users across the globe, and then let's say you have a user in South Africa or from other part of the world where AWS doesn't have its region, well, you could make sure that your application could be served from the as location in South Africa via Amazon CloudFront instead of making the users go to wherever the next closest AWS region would be. So AWS as location actually increases the performance of the application for the user. Next, let's talk about the waveland zone. A waveland zone is a logical extension of the region. It's a new type of AWS infrastructure designed to run the workload that require ultra low latency over the mobile network. AWS deploy its infrastructure within communication service providers network, so application traffic from 5G devices can reach the servers running in the waveland zone without leaving the telecommunication network. Waveland zone is fully integrated with AWS services such as Lambda, S3, and DynamoDB. Waveland zone allow the developers to deploy and run the applications on the as of 5G network. Currently, waveland zones are available in a very limited availability. Waveland zone is a fully managed and scalable service. The application can then be hosted in waveland zone that is co-located within a mobile provider's data center. An example of how an application might use the AWS waveland zone is an online gaming application that is designed for mobile users. Traditionally, this kind of applications would be hosted in a central data center which would then be accessed by mobile users over the internet. But with AWS Waveland Zone, the application can now be hosted in Waveland Zone that is co-located within a mobile network provider's data center. That means the mobile user of that application don't need to travel outside of mobile provider's network to access the application. So this gives the ultra low latency access of applications for all mobile users. You will definitely not like to spend the unlimited amount of money on AWS. So you should have some checks to avoid the spending. In this module, we will discuss about different ways to optimize and reduce the cost when using the AWS services. There are many cost optimization strategies available depending on the specific services and resources. AWS allows the customer to set the budgets and alerts in the AWS cost management tool to monitor and control their spendings on the platform. There are different types of budget that you can create, such as cost budget. AWS cost budget allow you to set a budget for your AWS cost and receive the alerts when your actual cost exceed the budget amount. For example, you plan to spend $100 in a month on AWS services. You will get the alerts when your budget exceed the $100. This saves you from the unexpected AWS service bill. Usage budget. Usage budget allow you to set a budget for the uses of services. Usage budgets are similar to cost budgets, but allow you to set a budget for specific services such as number of S3 requests or the number of EC2 instances running. RI budget or reserved instances budget allow you to set a budget for your uses of reserved instances, which are type of pricing model offered by AWS that allow you to pay lower hourly rate for EC2 instances and RDS database for a 1 or 3 year commitment. Reserved instance budget helps you track your usage and cost of your reserved instances. You can set custom budget that alert you when your cost or usage exceed your budgeted amount. This can help customers stay within their budget and avoid the unexpected charges. If you are a AWS learner, you should definitely set your AWS cost budget to avoid the unexpected bill at the month end. Next, let's talk about the AWS Cost Explorer. If you are utilizing multiple AWS services like EC2 or S3, you would want to know how much you are spending on each service. AWS Cost Explorer is a tool that helps you to view your cost and usage data to analyze and identify the cost optimization opportunities. It helps you to see how much you are spending on each service and what are the possibilities to save the money. It also provides cost and usage data for different levels of granularity, such as by service, by instance, or by tag, that allow you to drill down into specific area of your AWS usage and cost. Cost Explorer can be used for budgeting and cost forecasting for the next 12 months. It also allows you to set budget, forecast the future cost, and see the past cost with the ability to see by time, by service, by resources. You can also use the Cost Explorer to create custom reports that can be used to share your cost and usage data with other members of your organization. AWS Cost Explorer is free to use for all AWS customers, and you can access it through AWS Management Console. Next, let's talk about how you can plan for your AWS cost. AWS cost planning is the process of determining how much it will cost to run your application and services on AWS. This includes forecasting the future cost, identifying the cost optimization opportunities, and creating a budget for your AWS uses. Now, there are some tools that can be used to plan your AWS future cost. AWS Pricing Calculator. Pricing Calculator is a tool that allows you to estimate the cost of running the various AWS services. You can use the calculator to estimate the cost for a variety of scenarios, such as running the specific number of EC2 instances for a certain period of time, storing a certain amount of data in S3, or delivering a certain amount of data through CloudFront. The calculator allows you to compare the cost for different types of instances, storage options, and other service configurations, such as different regions and data transfer options. AWS Migration Hub. AWS Migration Hub is a service provided by AWS that allows you to track and manage your application's migration on the AWS cloud. It allows you to track the progress of your migration using a dashboard and provides the detailed information. AWS Migration Hub can be used to migrate a wide range of applications, including on-prem, virtualized, cloud-based workload, as well as database and storage. The AWS Pricing Calculator is a web-based tool provided by AWS that allows the customer to estimate the cost associated with various AWS services. This allows the customer to add their specific resource requirement and generate the detailed cost estimate for their desired configuration. You can estimate the cost for a workload on the cloud using the calculator. For example, if you are looking to launch a website for your company and you believe you are going to need 10 web servers, two different database servers, well, you can enter all of these factors into the pricing calculator and determine how much it would cost and share the results with other. You can even look at different ways to build it and then compare the cost between the different approaches. Pricing calculator is very useful for cost optimization and planning. Next, let's talk about AWS resource tag. Tags are key value pairs that can be added to AWS resources in order to track and manage those resources. These are just metadata that can be assigned to the AWS resources. AWS tags include a name and an optional value. So let's say, for example, if we have a website that we are launching and we have 5 web servers, well, we could go in and just put the web server as a tag on each of those servers. And then when we want to explore our cost, we could say, okay, how much we are spending on everything that has a tag as web server. But another common use case here is to include the department, environment, or project. So let's say that you have some internal application that HR is using. What you can do is you could set a name of department and then you could enter in an optional value of HR. Or we could break it down by environment. Many times when we build the application in the cloud, we will have a testing environment and a production environment. So we could create a tag with the name of environment and the value could be either production or testing. Now with this, you can utilize your cost allocation report to see your cost grouped by active tags. Tags can be enabled within the Cost Explorer. Next, let's talk about AWS organization. AWS organizations allow you to create a centralized structure for multiple AWS accounts where you can view, manage, monitor, and control the cost. This allows the organizations to manage multiple accounts under a single master account. So instead of doing what we mentioned earlier with department and having HR, for example, as one of the department, we can actually create a completely separate AWS account for HR under a master account. It provides ability to organizations with the ability to leverage the consolidated billing for all accounts. So this means that even if you have 100 different AWS account using AWS organizations under a single master account, you only get one bill. And we can see within that bill a breakdown of our cost by account. It enables the organization to centralize logging and security standard across the accounts. We can also go into the cost explorer in the master account at a high level, and we can see the breakdown of our cost within each account. So we talked about tools provided by AWS to organize and optimize the cost in AWS environment. Let's quickly summarize the function of each tool. AWS budget allow you to set budget that prevent you to spend the unlimited amount of money on the AWS resources. Resource tag allow you to tag the resources and filter the resources for cost optimization and group the different resources. Cost Explorer helps you to see how much you are spending on each service in AWS. Cost Planning helps you to see how much would it cost to run the certain AWS services. AWS organization allow you to have centralized security logging and cost management. So these are the different tools provided by the AWS for the cost optimization. So we should be aware about the uses and function of these tools. Supporting AWS infrastructure involves a range of activities. It requires ongoing monitoring, maintenance, and management to ensure that your environment is running smoothly, securely, and cost effectively. So, next, we are going to talk about how you support your AWS infrastructure once you transition some of your applications to the cloud. So next, let's talk about the tools that AWS provide to support your infrastructure. And we are really talking about the AWS support, which is the service that enable you to file the support request with AWS resources. Within AWS support, there are two additional services that are also made available to you. The first is personal health dashboard and second is trusted advisor. So let's take a look at each of these services. Let's talk about the AWS trusted advisor. AWS Trusted Advisor helps you to optimize your use of AWS services. It's an automated tool to check your AWS uses against best practices. It checks your AWS infrastructure for potential issues and provide the recommendations for the improvement. It examines your security, performance, and cost efficiency settings and alerts you if there are any issues or if you could be saving some money. It also provides the actionable guidance on how to resolve the issues and improve your overall health of the AWS infrastructure. It's like having a personal advisor to check your AWS environment and give you the tips to improve it. All AWS customers get access to the 7 core checks of the trusted advisor, and it can be accessed from the AWS Management Console. Next, let's talk about AWS Personal Health Dashboard. Personal Health Dashboard is a web based service provided by AWS that helps AWS customers to improve their infrastructure health and performance. It provides real time alerts and guidance to help customers optimize their AWS resources, increase availability, and reduce the downtime. The Personal Health Dashboard monitors the health of the AWS services and resources used by the customer. It notifies about any potential issues such as service disruption or resource degradation and provide the recommendations to customers to resolve these issues quickly. Customers can use the AWS Personal Health Dashboard to view their account's overall health status, review the notifications and alerts, and manage their AWS resources. They can also customize the dashboard setting and filters to receive the alerts for specific services or resources. The AWS Personal Health Dashboard is free to use and available to all customers. Customers can access the dashboard through AWS Management Console, AWS CLI, or AWS SDK. Next, let's talk about the different support plans available to support the AWS infrastructure. There are different AWS support plan tiers available. Basic support. Basic support provide access to AWS Trusted Advisor and AWS documentations. Developer support provide 24/7 access to AWS support and access to the AWS Trusted Advisor. Business support provide 24/7 access to AWS support, AWS Trusted Advisor, and account management features. Enterprise support provide 24/7 access to AWS support, AWS Trusted Advisor, account management features, and technical account manager. So we need to understand the difference between the different support plan tiers available, and it really falls into four key areas. The first is communication method, which means how you can communicate with the AWS support engineers. Response time, which means how early you expect AWS to respond on your queries. And then we have the level of support, which means up to what level of support you want AWS to offer. And then we have the cost. So based on the response time, level of support, AWS charge the cost of the support services. So let's talk about the different types of support services offered by the AWS in more detail. First, we have the AWS Basic Support. AWS Basic Support is a cost-effective support plan and is available for all AWS customers and users who need assistance with AWS core services. The basic support include access to AWS documentations, white papers, and FAQs, as well as the ability to open and manage the support case with AWS. Basic support plan include a monthly usage report, access to AWS Trusted Advisor, and the ability to use the AWS personal health dashboard to view the operational health of your resources. The cost of basic support is based on the total monthly usage of AWS services, and there is no minimum fee. Next, we have AWS Developer Support. AWS Developer Support is a support plan for developers that provides additional assistance with AWS services, such as the technical guidance and troubleshooting. This plan includes all features of the basic support. This plan is for developers who need more advanced support than what is included with the basic support. With developer support, you have access to technical experts who can help you with the code level issues, and you can also receive guidance on best practices for developing and deploying the applications on the AWS. Additionally, you get access to AWS technical support APIs and the AWS support center, which include tools for managing your support cases. The cost of developer support is based on the total monthly usage of the AWS services, and there is a minimum monthly fee. Developer support is limited to one primary contact, so that individual need to be the one who actually file the support request with the AWS. Next, let's talk about the AWS business support. AWS business support include all features of developer support and provides the full 24/7 technical support for businesses using the AWS services. This plan is designed for organizations that have high volume of users. It includes all features of developer support and full set of trusted advisor checks. With business support, you have 24/7 phone, email, and chat access to support engineers. So you can directly pick up a phone and actually call an engineer. Business support allow you to let all your resources have access to support center and file the support request. With AWS Business Support, you have access to a dedicated technical account manager who can help you with strategic planning, architecture design, and operational best practices. So, if you are in a scenario where you want help in deploying a third party software into AWS, this is the support tier that will help you. AWS Business Support starts at $100 per month and it is tied to your AWS usage. So, with more AWS usage, you would end up paying more than just $100 per month. Next, let's talk about the AWS Enterprise Support. This plan includes 24/7 access to AWS technical support, a designated technical account manager, and access to online and in person training, as well as other benefits such as architectural guidance, best practices, and access to the AWS Trusted Advisor. It is designated for businesses that require a high level of support and have a critical need for AWS resources and services. Enterprise support starts at $15,000 per month. The cost of AWS enterprise support varies depending on the level of AWS usage. It is based on percentage of the overall AWS usage cost. So in this module, we started off by understanding the tools that are provided by AWS to support the workload in the cloud. And then we reviewed the specific AWS support plan tiers that they provide. We then talked about the AWS Trusted Advisor Check and the Personal Health Dashboard. So I hope you get the basic idea of the AWS support plans available and you can opt the best support plan as per your business requirements. Let's talk about how can we interact with the AWS platform to access the services. There are different approaches to interact with the AWS platform and to access the AWS hosted applications. AWS Management Console. This is a web-based interface that allows you to access and manage the AWS services using a web browser. AWS Command Line Interface. This is a command line tool that allows you to interact with AWS services using commands. It can be installed on your local machine and configured with your AWS credentials. AWS SDK. These are software development kits that allow you to interact with AWS services from your application code. AWS provides SDK for several programming languages such as Java, .NET, Python, Ruby, and more. AWS Application Programming Interfaces. AWS services expose the APIs that can be accessed over the internet using standard protocols such as HTTP and HTTPS. Developers can use these APIs to programmatically interact with the AWS services. AWS partner and third party tools. There are many third party tools and services available that integrate with the AWS and provides additional functionalities. Some examples include monitoring and management tools, analytic tools, and security tools. Now, let's talk about when you would use one of these approaches versus another. So, first of all, the console is a great method for accessing the AWS services very first time. So, if you want to access a service for the first time, if you want to spin up a virtual server, or maybe you want to test out a new service that AWS just announced, the console is a great way to do this. But for the repeated task, you might want to use either CLI or the SDK. If we require a person to log in into the browser to perform the repeated task, that can be very cumbersome. And if you need to do the repeated task continuously, that becomes a great choice for the automation.
and both CLI and SDK can enable that automation. SDK enable the automation of AWS tasks within the custom applications. So if you have a custom application that you are running on the AWS platform and you want to automate the application to interact with the AWS services, the SDK becomes a great choice for that. Now it's important to note here, most of the services and actions can be performed using any of these ways. Now there are some exceptions to that rule and we will cover a few of those within this course. But at a high level, just note that for most of the services, you will be able to use either CLI, console or SDK to perform whatever task you want to perform on those applications.